Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
Hello and welcome to World Today, the panel discussion with me, Anna, in Beijing. The recent talks between Russia and the United States in Alaska, followed closely by the U.S.-Ukraine-Europe meeting in Washington, may have concluded, but their impact continues to unfold. While both Washington and Moscow described the Alaska talks as constructive and productive, no agreement was reached on the Russian-Ukraine conflict. The subsequent meeting in Washington, meanwhile, highlighted persistent rifts between the U.S. and Europe. The United States informed a small group of allies representing Europe's economic and military strength that it plans to play a minimal role in any security guarantees for Ukraine, one of the clearest signs yet that Europe will need to shoulder the burden of keeping lasting peace in Kiev. In response, the European Council convened an emergency video conference to address the situation in Ukraine, while EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas outlined a timetable for the next round of sanctions against Russia. Where does the Russian-Ukraine conflict go from here? After the Alaska meeting, what kind of new diplomatic contest will unfold among the U.S., Europe, Russia, and Ukraine? To delve into this, joining us on the line are Josef Mahoney, Professor of Politics and International Relations at East China Normal University. Great to have you, Professor.
Thank you.
Yaqi, Research Assistant at Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
George Tzogopoulos, Director of EU-China Programs and Senior Research Fellow at European Institute of Nice. Great to have you, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
Gentlemen, let's first review the highly anticipated U.S.-Russia talks in Alaska. This marked President Putin's first visit to U.S. soil in 10 years and the first Putin-Trump meeting in 6 years. Professor Mahoney, how would you assess the uniqueness of this meeting and the driving forces behind it?
Well, I think on the one hand, I would say that it was more dramatic than the meeting that we saw between Kim Jong-un and Trump during his first term in office. Initially, I was very surprised that Putin was willing to go to, Alaska, to an American military base, given all the, animosity that's been directed against him. Although the U.S. is not someone who recognizes the ICJ, there are arrest warrants out for him. But nevertheless, it was clearly an opportunity for him to step back onto the world stage in the West, where, a position that he's been denied, and to articulate very clearly, I think, what his positions are. And I think this is a remarkable step forward. It's one that certainly has created a lot of hand-wringing in Europe and among some corners in the United States. But above all, I think what it does is it gives the Western mainstream an opportunity to start to come to terms with the reality on the ground, which is Russia has essentially won this conflict, and we now need to find a way to move forward with that situation.
Mm-hmm. Professor Tzogopoulos, in previous high-level summits, normally diplomatic teams spend considerable time negotiating the timing, venue, and agenda. But many observers consider this summit somewhat sudden. Do you agree with that assessment? How do you see this meeting and the driving forces behind this?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily agree with this observation because several important meetings between American and Russian diplomats took place before the Alaska meeting. That is to say that some preparatory work had been already done before. Certainly, it is very important that when President Trump came to power, he devoted much political capital to resolving the Ukrainian question. And within this context, his personal meeting with President Putin would be very important. I wouldn't say that everything had been arranged before the meeting, but at the same time, important details had been certainly settled before the Alaska meeting between the two presidents.
Mm-hmm. Yaqi, what's your take? Because since resuming the presidency, President Trump has repeatedly pushed for peace negotiations on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but with little progress. Why did President Putin agree to meet President Trump face-to-face at this particular moment?
Yeah. I guess for President Putin, the motivations were twofold. So first, there was immense economic pressure Western sanctions and falling oil revenue had pushed Russia's federal budget into its highest deficit in 3 decades, making the war effort increasingly difficult to sustain indefinitely. So I guess he urgently needed a path towards sanctions relief. And second, just as important was the need to, as those my colleagues just said, to break Russia's diplomatic isolation. So we talk about despite an ICC arrest warrant, so he can still legitimately visit the US. This could be considered as a major symbolic victory. If we are talking about the part for the Trump's motivation, I think just as you mentioned, the calculus was primarily domestic to embody this deal maker personnel and to fulfill his long-held campaign promise to end this war quickly. So the objective was a lot less about painstaking work of crafting a just peace and more of securing a high-profile diplomatic win for his electorate.
Mm-hmm. We know Professor and Putin met in Alaska for over 2 hours. Afterward, both described the dialogue as constructive, yet no ceasefire or peace framework was agreed. Professor Mahoney, what does this pattern of positive statements but non-tangible results reveal about the core differences between the U.S. and Russia regarding the Russian-Ukraine conflict? Have either side's strategic intentions been partially achieved, in your opinion?
Well, I do think it has set the stage for what comes next. I think we've heard Trump has articulated a 2-week timetable to see what sort of breakthroughs might be achieved. Some people are optimistic we might see a trilateral summit. I'm not very optimistic that we'll see Zelensky and Putin sitting down with each other in that time frame. But nevertheless, I do think Trump is setting the stage to sort of either move forward or even wash his hands of this. I would say that I agree with Lee Lauscher that there was this impetus to try to resolve this because it was a campaign issue for Trump. But I think we've also seen that it's part of his larger strategy in terms of how he's approaching trade negotiations with China and India. And there's a sense that if he could somehow or another break the impasse with Russia, that this would leave him in a better position to sort of consolidate the American position. And here again, just I know things can get very, very complicated because we have so many actors involved here. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we might see, for example, in the next week or so, is him reinforcing U.S. commitments to provide security guarantees, but also backstopping Europe to really shoulder that while also still sustaining a stronger commitment to NATO that he's wanted to give. And maybe even he'll shave a couple of points off of the 15% trade tariff that he negotiated with Europe. So I think there's all sorts of little things going on here. When we saw all the European leaders, going to Washington to sort of back up Zelensky, certainly I think that they have some interest in the security of Ukraine. Certainly they've invested heavily in their own political brands. But at the same time, I think they're much more focused on the future of NATO and whatever sort of new sort of trade terms they might be able to negotiate with Trump. At the same time, we saw just, I think, yesterday or just in sometime recently, Macron, was describing Putin as an ogre at our doorstep, as a predator. And these are sort of, I understand people have, this demonization that's taken place and it's gone to where it is. But I think it's rather clear that Russia doesn't want to go further than it has. It has largely achieved its territorial strategic goals. And these broadly align with reestablishing defensive positions that were first discerned during the reign of Catherine the Great. So what we see, I think, is Russia trying simply to draw a better defensive position against NATO. We'll see something like NATO, an Article 5 type resolution for Ukraine. And then we'll move forward. So this idea that Russia is still encroaching, that it still wants to take parts of Europe, is completely out of step with the fact that Russia is increasingly turning towards Asia and how it can foster better ties in the East. So there's a little bit of a disconnect between the rhetoric, but there's also this much bigger political game that I think is being played in terms of geostrategy between the United States and Europe.
Professor Tzogopoulos, do you share the same stance? How do you rate this pattern of positive statements but no tangible results between U.S. and Russia? And from today's perspective, what are Russia's objectives in peace negotiations or in the broader Russia-Ukraine conflict?
Well, to start with, the Alaska meeting was extremely significant, but it would be impossible for the United States and Russia to reach a deal about Ukraine without the participation of Ukraine. So what the meeting did in particular was to conclude about how the two powers could reach an agreement about Ukraine, come up with a proposal. This proposal was conveyed to President Zelensky 3 days later in Washington, D.C. And then President Zelensky, in cooperation with his European partners, made another proposal that President Trump conveyed to President Putin. So there is an ongoing diplomatic process. And as external observers, we don't know the details of proposals which are being made, apart from some general terms and conditions which are discussed in the public and media agenda. So it's very difficult to prognosticate up to what extent it might be possible to have an agreement or not on the Ukrainian crisis. But at the same time, it is clear that President Trump is paving the way for the diplomatic process to continue. As far as Russia is concerned, certainly Russia has some clear strategic goals, and it feels that it is better placed to serve those goals in comparison to the situation before the beginning of the war in 2022. And I'm saying that because although the initial objectives of Russia during the war were not served, certainly in the last 3 years and a half, the Russian military is gaining some ground in the eastern territory of Ukraine. So President Putin is prepared to certainly base his position on the results on the ground, and at the same time exploit the moment because President Trump is prepared to start or to relaunch US-Russian negotiations. So these two pillars are, I would say, the main ones of the Russian trust strategy as far as US-Russian relations are concerned and the Ukraine conflict is concerned. So for Russia to gain a political ground on the basis of its military advancement, and for Russia to resettle its relationship with the West, primarily with the United States.
Yaqi, what's your take? The summit didn't address any key details such as disputed territories, and Ukraine was not included in the core negotiations. Does this great power-led small states absent model create potential pitfalls for future talks, in your opinion? Why didn't the US and Russia choose to move directly to a trilateral meeting?
From my point of view, and actually from the one that I'm holding now in Singapore and in a lot of countries in ASEAN, like we don't have too much trust in this, what you might call the great power-led small state absent model. So from my point of view, this model is not just a pitfall, it's actually a very dangerous precedent that strikes at the heart of this international system. And I think it validates the idea that the fate of smaller nations can be decided over their hands. So to reduce them to objects in a geopolitical game. And to say for the choice to proceed bilaterally, I think it was a calculated one. For Russia, it serves the long-standing goal of framing the conflict as a struggle with the US, thereby diminishing the Ukraine's role as, to say, their own pursuit of sovereignty and a status of an independent actor. And for the current US administration, a one-on-one meeting offered a simpler, much more controllable environment, free from the legally complex and principal demands that I guess a lot of European and Ukrainian representatives would bring, thus clearing the path for a more straightforward top-down deal, and that I think President Trump is looking for. After all, I don't think the model that excludes the Ukrainian participation is very sustainable. I do think that, as a lot of my colleagues just mentioned, the later preceding European conferences could maybe help us to more involve those smaller actors' opinion into the account.
Then, gentlemen, let's shift gear to the U.S.-Ukraine White House meeting. The atmosphere of President Zelensky's meeting with President Trump drew considerable attention compared to the heated exchanges 6 months ago. President Zelensky during this visit was reportedly more cordial, with multiple expressions of thanks. And his attire shifted from military style to a formal suit. So how do you interpret this change? Is it driven by battlefield pressures, or is it a strategic compromise regarding U.S.-Russia negotiations?
Well, it's interesting because before the meeting took place, there was a report that Zelensky would, in fact, wear military attire. Mm-hmm. So, it's sort of funny that this is sort of an indicator of his mindset, but then ultimately he showed up in a suit. I think, honestly, the earlier meeting between Trump and Zelensky with Vance there, that ended up really undermining the American position. If we go back to that meeting, we should recall that Zelensky's legitimacy was questioned by the U.S. administration. They said, you've overextended your stay in office. There hasn't been an election. I think Trump was digging a deep hole for himself, in so much as who else does he have other than Zelensky at this point to negotiate with? So that's a concern. And so I think that on the one hand, Zelensky wanted to avoid unnecessarily antagonizing the White House. And then certainly we had, the very dramatic show of the various European leaders coming to sort of protect him from the bully in the White House. But I think it was good for everyone to come because it allowed for this more inclusive participation after they had been excluded from the Alaska meetings. And let's be clear, I don't think any of the leaders who came to Washington wanted to meet Putin. So I think it's good, although I agree that it's troubling to have this small state absence. At the same time, it was only going to be the case that I think Trump is going to sit down and have these discussions and be able to start brokering something potentially. But nevertheless, I think it was good that they all came. I don't think that Zelensky was going to get hammered in any event the way he did before. I think, Trump is now in a position where he's trying to reach a deal, and that's going to be very, very difficult for Zelensky, given the legal considerations in Ukraine itself. It requires an act of parliament. It requires a referendum. Reportedly, 75% of the Ukrainian people don't want to give up the land, don't want to make concessions. I think his return, the counterproposal that Zelensky has made and that the Europeans have supported, is that there'll be no land concessions, which doesn't reflect the reality on the ground. But, there are other ways that this could move forward. There have been so many uses of emergency protocols in Ukraine. It's possible that they could concede loss of control without necessarily formally ceding the territory. So I think the ball is rolling, and I think that while it's premature to be optimistic, nevertheless, there is an opening for the diplomacy to work.
Mm-hmm. Professor Mahoney, as you've observed, President Zelensky now faces an extremely difficult situation with legitimacy questions from the United States. Do you think he might step down from his position as Ukraine's president, or could Ukraine be heading toward a new leadership?
I think that it's sort of a mixed bag. When I was doing field work in Ukraine 2 summers ago, everywhere I went, I found people who didn't like Zelensky. Let me be clear. When I was there, everyone had this perception that this was indeed a proxy war between the United States and Russia. And this was something that was taboo to say in Europe, but it was something that everyone understood. And it was illegal to say in Ukraine, but everyone understood this was, or at least this is how they perceived it. And, I remember meeting with Azov battalion commanders in Poltava. They said the same thing that I heard from Ukrainian soldiers in Kiev and elsewhere, that ultimately Zelensky would, by his own course or through pressure from others, would betray Ukraine. Everyone was, steeling themselves for that eventuality. So I don't know. I haven't heard that he's going to step down. I think there's projections that, if he's able to get this over the line and we can find some sort of resolution, that one of the things it would include would be a security provision for him and his family to leave Ukraine and settle somewhere else. But be that as it may, we're still in this very difficult moment, not only for him, but for the country.
Professor Tzogopoulos, how do you see this? Because reports indicate that President Zelensky submitted a document to the U.S. outlining his demands for a future peace agreement, insisting on maintaining Ukraine's territorial integrity and requiring full compensation from Russia for all losses caused by the conflict. How realistic are these demands, and to what extent could his change and his visit help Ukraine secure more tangible safety guarantees?
Yes, let me start by saying what I mentioned before, that we do not know all the details of negotiations between Ukraine and the United States following the important Alaska meeting between Presidents Trump and Putin. Certainly, if Ukraine wants to reach a deal with Russia, the situation in the battleground needs to be at some point acknowledged. And such an acknowledgement has to be part of the agreement. I don't know exactly up to what extent Russian military forces are advancing in Ukraine. And I don't know exactly the demands that President Putin is making and up to what extent Russia wants to add additional territories to what it has already conquered in the battlefield. I've read the media reports, but I'm a bit skeptical due to the critical moment and due to the lack of information. So I stick to the main point, which is that if Ukraine, under the current circumstances, is prepared to reach a deal with Russia, this deal will be based on a compromise. Certainly, this compromise does not only mean that Ukraine will lose, it also means that President Zelensky or the Ukraine in general will need to offer something to its citizens for fighting against Russia in the last 3 years and a half. So if a president of a country which is under attack in the last 3 years and a half is about to reach an agreement about ending this war, certainly the citizens of his own country might put into question why this war continued for 3 years and a half to lead to a result which is not good for the country itself. So up to what extent President Zelensky will have to offer to his own citizens hope about security guarantees coming from the United States, about real expectations to enter the European Union or something like that, is to be negotiated. But a compromise is always a compromise. It means that both sides need to give something. But certainly the situation in the battleground cannot but be acknowledged.
Mm-hmm. Yaqi, what's your take? Because one thing we know for sure at this point is that President Trump has stated that he no longer supports a temporary ceasefire, but instead seeks a comprehensive peace agreement. In light of his recent meeting with President Zelensky, do you think Ukraine might consider making territorial concession in exchange for peace?
Yeah, I think this kind of gap between as you mentioned, the proposal to have a full compensation from Russia and this very largely supported Trump grand bargain is very tense right now. And I mean, from the perspective of President Zelensky, I guess he must have been put under a lot of pressure. I mean, from the last case that we observed in that dramatic meeting happening in White House just months ago, this entire international media was quite supportive of his speech. And after that, you can see the new British Prime Minister and all the major European officials come to support President Zelensky. But I guess for this time, as we already see this tension has been going so long, so I guess for this time, there may be some silver lining in terms of the kind of the framing of the compromises that may come, but it may not come very neatly in one, let's say, permanent settlement or a permanent concession of a specific territory, but may come as a form of a non-binding, very vaguely defined term to, let's say, to sort of define the issue, the essence of the territory held by Russia. I think that could be one of the potential scenarios.
Thank you, gentlemen. Let's have a short break. Coming back, we'll continue our discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back to World Today, where we continue our panel discussion on the latest developments in the Russian-Ukraine conflict and the political dynamics involving the U.S. and Europe. Professor Mahoney, President Trump reiterated U.S. security guarantees for Ukraine, but emphasized that Europe should take the lead. How does this differ from previous U.S. policy toward Ukraine, and does it imply a strategic withdrawal, shifting responsibility for Ukraine onto Europe?
You know, it's a difficult question to answer. I think I don't hold the position that Russia aims to continue to advance much further than what we've already seen. That it's secured its minimal strategic objectives. It's created its land bridge to Crimea. Crimea is now solidly protected. But at the same time, we've seen this narrative in Ukraine that although there's been a tremendous loss, the Ukrainians still manage a tremendous win because they have a narrative there that Putin's objective was to take the whole country, and that little Ukraine was still nevertheless capable of rallying international support and stopping Russia there at where we see them presently. With this in mind, we have this narrative on the one side that Russia still wants to take more territory. It's part of the Ukrainian victory story in a way because they stopped them. And it's still something that the Europeans are raising as a central concern, that Russia is threatening all of Europe. So this is a story that people are vested in politically for a variety of reasons. But I don't think the view in the White House is that Russia intends to go much further. And indeed, I don't think there's a perspective that Russia can go much further. We have seen not only achieve their strategic objectives, we've also seen them reach their limits. If they could have taken more, they would have. But that isn't going to change. So I think one of the things we see with Trump is that there could be some sort of strategic guarantees. I think it, again, depends on what sort of mineral wealth the U.S. might be able to take out of Ukraine and wants to protect. Certainly, it may be security guarantees in the mode of Trump, which appeared to be more oriented towards sanctions or trade penalties, tariffs, so forth and so on, avoiding more the direct military intervention, except in extreme cases, as we saw in terms of the U.S. support for Israel against Iran. So I don't think we're really quite sure. I think that there's an understanding in Ukraine. It's unlikely Ukraine will be admitted into the EU anytime soon. It's impossible that Ukraine will be made a member of NATO, but it still remains to be worked out how you could have this reassurance force from the European side that would be backstopped in some way with diplomatic, trade, and perhaps some sort of other technological military support from the U.S. Although it's clear that Trump would rather not provide those guarantees. And here I would say that one of the interesting things to consider is it was Trump that set the stage for the U.S. abandoning Afghanistan. And although that was carried through by Biden in sort of a catastrophic way, it's clear that Trump doesn't see this war as something that he should be responsible for. He believes it was something that was egregiously advanced by his predecessor, and he would like to get away from it as quickly as possible.
Professor Tzogopoulos, from European perspective, how do you view Washington's withdrawal? And we see reports say this series of meetings highlighted divergence between the United States and Europe over issues such as whether a ceasefire is needed or who bears the primary burden of military spending to Ukraine. How do you assess the current transatlantic differences? And could these disagreements further strain the U.S.-European alliances?
Well, to start with, President Trump wants to mediate and contribute to an agreement between Russia and Ukraine, the one way or the other. So if he fails to do that, irrespective of whom he might blame, for a potential failure, it will also be his own failure because he has promised that he would resolve this conflict. So I start with this basic observation. Then, as far as the role of the European Union or the role of some European countries, to be precise, because what happened in the important Washington meeting is that only a few European countries were represented, is that these European countries are prepared and are determined to play a role in Ukraine, but this role will be a secondary role, right? That is to say that Europe, the European Union, and let aside the UK for a little bit, depends heavily on the United States as far as security is concerned. So it is at first the priority for President Zelensky to negotiate with President Trump about security guarantees coming from the United States, because if the security guarantees do not come from the United States, then obviously the power of the security guarantees will not be as strong as it could be with the participation of the US. So if President Zelensky gets the guarantees from the side of the US, then Europe will certainly step in order to help strengthen the American mission. And it is here also where President Trump is looking at, because President Trump already put pressure on NATO, European allies of the United States to spend more on defense. But beyond spending, Europeans also will be assigned with additional portfolios as far as Ukraine is concerned. But the condition in order for this to happen might be for an agreement between the US and Ukraine on security guarantees. As far as the rift, a potential rift between the United States and the EU is concerned, it's clear that they have different positions on the Ukrainian question. I think it's obvious. At the same time, however, if we are looking at the calculations the Europeans are making, it is certain that they are dependent on the United States, so that they might have to follow the path that President Trump is leading, because there is no alternative. So certainly there is a rift, but at the same time, for the Europeans, the only way forward is to collaborate with the United States in that regard.
Yaqi, how would you assess the U.S. approach to its European allies under Trump administration, and what irreconcilable differences exist between the two sides?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think this represents a very significant and a decisive departure from the previous U.S. policy. I mean, the Biden administration's approach to say, now we are back, we are going to re-cooperate with our European ally to build rebuild these transatlantic alliances and to utilize actually the Ukrainian crisis as a moment to retake some of our consensus. I mean, they are doing this renewal of the security architecture. But for this administration, I think it's very clear that they are moving toward the model of offshore balancing. They are trying to imply a strategic shift of responsibility for European security onto Europeans themselves. And I think, just as some of my colleagues already mentioned, this had to be looked into a very large strategic image where the current administration actually taking the move they call prioritization, which means they will now shift more resources, more strategic attention into Indo-Pacific. And I think this point has been well mentioned by the interim guidance paper, and maybe some of the speeches we heard from one of the defense officials, Edward Kirby. So I think the constant refrain that Europe must take the lead and bear the lion's share of the burden is the central pillar of this new policy. You know, why we heard about this administration expressing willingness to help out with what they call Article 5-like protection. It has also been clear that this will involve a minimal US role and no American boots on the ground. I think this will create a credibility gap, a security guarantee not backed by the full and unique might of the US military, including its largest intelligence and air power, risks being seen by Moscow as a paper tiger. And I think this also risks being seen by other European countries, especially those countries on the East Front, some countries like Poland, insufficient to deter a future crisis from happening.
Mm-hmm. Gentlemen, let's talk about the sanctions against Russia from the European side. Following the White House meeting, the European Council held an emergency video conference and announced that a new round of sanctions against Russia would be introduced in September. The EU has already implemented 18 rounds of sanctions. So, Professor Mahoney, with the new measures targeting areas such as Russian energy revenues, given Russia's gradual adaptation to sanctions and Europe's own economic energy pressures, how effective this new round of sanctions likely to be?
Well, I see it as posturing by the Europeans. I think that they feel rather impotent in the moment, and they want to try to assert, at least rhetorically, some sort of power and punitive measures directed against Russia. I know that Lara was talking earlier about the duress that the sanctions have placed on Russia. And the counterpoint there is we should go back to the early days of the struggle when all of the sanctions were put in place. And we were told that it would lead to the collapse of Russia, that it would lead to the collapse of the government, that it would force a tremendous defeat on them. And what we have seen instead is a tremendous resilience in the Russian economy. And indeed, this was a resilience that had already been built up from the sanctions that had long preceded this conflict in Ukraine, that Russia had already made significant adjustments. And I think there have been a number of studies that show that a great number of the people living in Russia are not very much affected directly by these pressures. I'm not saying that they don't cause difficulties for Russia. I'm saying that they have proven themselves to be insufficient from deterring Russia from continuing to prosecute the war in Ukraine. I think this is one of the reasons, we saw Trump saying that there could be severe consequences in terms of sanctions if Putin didn't move forward, but then we didn't hear, at least in public announcements. And I agree here with George that we've actually heard different reporting coming out of the Alaska meeting, some saying Putin was willing to give up more than Trump anticipated, others saying that he was still asking for more territory. So we don't really know what precisely was said, but it's been also widely reported that Trump did not broach sanctions because I think Trump realizes these are not going to work in the case of Russia. And so I think, and this is what spurred the Europeans who were frustrated by this to say that they were going to impose more sanctions. Again, I don't think that this is going to move the ball. It's just posturing.
Professor Tzogopoulos, what's your analysis on Europe's sanctions against Russia? Because many media outlets have emphasized Europe's sense of urgency and helplessness after Washington's shift of attitude toward Russia. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, it is important to mention that there is a negotiation process which is continuing, right? Now that we are speaking, the war in Ukraine is continuing. We have no ceasefire, and obviously we have no peace agreement. So what we know is that the European Union is prepared to renew or to decide about a new round of sanctions in a couple of weeks from now, which is placed in the context of its economic policy vis-à-vis Russia following the beginning of the war. So it is understandable that without an agreement, the public rhetoric of the European Union has not changed. But as I said before, what is highly significant is to look at the general European response to the Ukraine conflict following the Washington meeting where some European leaders participated. So I was not there to be aware of the details of negotiations between President Trump and the European leaders, but I assume that there is a degree of coordination in what they are both doing. Because you can understand that if the European Union would announce that it would completely change course and not proceed with additional sanctions, then it could be considered as a diplomatic victory for Russia. So the process is continuing. President Trump is still devoting political capital to a potential agreement that could lead to a ceasefire or a peace agreement. And we have to wait and see. But for now, the European Union is not officially changing course vis-à-vis Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And let me just interject here.
Yes,
One
please.
thing to note is that there's been no candid discussion in Europe about the way European companies have gone around the sanctions, how we've seen this tremendous uptick over the last couple of years in European companies doing business in Central Asia with the understanding that those services and products were moving on to Russia. So again, there's sort of a shell game being played here. And a lot of it has to do with just giving us sound bites in the media about Europe standing strong, but it does reflect a desperation.
Yes, this is also a good remark. We don't have to look only to Central Asia, as Professor Mahoney said. We can also look closer to Europe, to where Turkey is, right? There are many ways on how sanctions could be circumvented. I mean, it's clear.
Mm-hmm. Yaqi, would you like to weigh in on this? In your opinion, how effective is this next round of sanctions against Russia likely to be?
Yeah, largely I agree with two colleagues just mentioned that you do face a lot of realistic barrier in terms of actually carrying out this maybe US-like sanctions mechanism, because there's an asymmetric effectiveness between those two regimes. So US sanctions tend to have a greater impact due to the dollar's dominance and the fear of secondary sanction. What EU lacks is a comparable enforcement mechanism. If you consider Europe itself, their own economic pressures, the energy crisis, the cost of supporting refugees, I mean, there are real domestic political limits to how much economic pain Europe can inflict on Russia without further harming itself. And let's just also consider their own election pressure, I guess, like between those European countries and Russia. I mean, they cannot endure the same amount of domestic pressure if those domestic inflation is going to hurt themselves.
Yaqi, following the Alaska meeting, President Putin held phone calls with leaders from India, Brazil, South Africa, and several Central Asian countries. These have been interpreted as related to the Trump meeting summit. How might this summit affect the interests of these countries, and what implications could it have for China as well?
Yes, so this was a very calculated strategic offensive. So Putin initiated those talks because it was a powerful demonstration that Russia is not isolated. He wanted to position himself as a central figure in the global affair, and especially in this new arena, a lot of people are calling Global South. Second, I think Putin initiated the talk to consolidate what he envisioned as a purely non-Western consensus, even though those countries participated in do not subscribe to this idea. By framing the conflict as a part of a larger struggle against the Western hegemony, he finds a receptive audience in many parts of the Global South, especially among BRIC nations facing their own pressure from the US. But from China, I guess the implications are complex. On one hand, Russia's actions serve Beijing's interests by detracting US attention and strengthening the anti-hegemonic coalition that I guess some of the people in Beijing also subscribe to. But on the other hand, potential US-Russia rapprochement, as a lot of people may call as a reverse Kissinger, is a risk. Although I know this largely fantasized reverse Kissinger may not be fully implemented on the ground, but what Trump administration has explicitly framed is its engagement with Moscow is to utilize it as a way to create the distance between Russia and China. So Beijing will be watching very cautiously for any US attempt to leverage a deal with Russia, even though it's not substantive, maybe just use that way to create this domestic rhetoric to picture Trump as another geopolitical master, just as Kissinger does. But I will say that it's still an arena that Beijing needs to watch very carefully. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Professor Mahoney, how do you interpret President Putin's move? How could this summit shape the strategic interests of those countries, and what are the potential implications for China?
Well, I'd like to go back to an earlier point that was raised and problematize it. I strongly disagree with the idea that China has benefited strategically from this war. I do think that it has demonstrated the limits of American power. That's always a good thing. I think it's demonstrated the resiliency of Russia. That's not a bad thing for China in so much as Russia is an important strategic partner. But, this idea that this war was somehow distracting the United States from its so-called Asia pivot is highly misleading. I think if you look at all the things that Biden did up until 2023, there was nothing slowing him down. In fact, he moved so quickly and so deeply that it started tripping over a number of Beijing's red lines. And we began to see the whole thing falling apart. And it was Biden pushed it without restraint. And I'm not going to go back and do a laundry list of everything that Biden did. But as he was doing this, we began to see certain countries like India realizing that they were being put in a position where they were going to be fundamentally compromised, that they would end up in a security and development trap vis-a-vis the US, in so much as the US was trying to contain and limit China. So I think all of that idea that the US pivot to Asia really collapsed for the most part as a real strategic threat or as a growing strategic threat in 2023. And what we see now is a very different approach with Trump. I don't think we yet really understand where he's going to take that relationship. But I do think it's clear to China that the conflict in Ukraine severely undermined China's interest in Europe. It has created a lot of problems for Chinese companies. I was speaking to an executive with a company that produces products that can't be sold in the West because the West restricts them, but they also can't be sold to Russia because China has imposed voluntarily a ban on any products that could be construed as lethal assistance. It's something that has complicated China's position in the West and done so at a time when there have been other tremendous headwinds that need to be dealt with. So in this case, I think that what we'll see is China being very, very supportive of peace. And again, we saw this with his foreign minister, that this was something that was really strongly pushed by Beijing and a number of walls in Moscow, unfortunately. And then China took a more delicate approach, I would argue. But nevertheless, I think Putin is trying to convey to countries that have been friendly to him sort of a friendly consultation model. But I think it's also been clear that Putin is calling his own shots. And again, this was another narrative that we heard in the West, that China was the big brother in this relationship and that President Xi could simply tell Putin to stop and that would be the end of it. That's not the way the relationship works. And certainly Russia is going to pursue its own agenda, but not without showing respect and recognition to the countries that do have positive relations with Russia.
Professor Tzogopoulos, from your perspective, how might the summit impact these nations that Putin contacted, and what does it hold for China?
Let me start by saying that certainly the policy of President Donald Trump to approach Russia makes a clear difference with that of his predecessor. Right? It's clear right now that Russia and the United States are talking to each other. And to some point, Russia has come out of diplomatic isolation as far as the United States is concerned. But this does not mean that differences in US-Russian relations will completely disappear. So these divergences between the two and differences are structural. They go deep into their misunderstanding of the international system for approximately 20, 25 years, right? So this does not change immediately because President Trump and President Putin are talking to each other. So at first, we have to assess up to what extent it might be possible for US-Russian relations to come to a point of stability. We haven't reached this point yet in order to assess up to what extent such a stability might affect others. And my second point in that regard is that right now the international system is composed of different actors who are serving their own interests. For example, the Sino-Russian partnership is rock and solid. So there are many reasons why China and Russia are collaborating for a period of 15 years or so. So these reasons, again, will not disappear because Trump and Putin are talking to each other. I would be quite reserved in diagnosing a tremendous impact on others because of the Alaska meeting. On the contrary, I would employ a wait-and-see approach to see even if President Trump manages to stop the Ukraine war, because President Trump might change his mind now that we are talking and completely abandon this policy of resettling the relationship with Russia. So let's wait and see.
Then, gentlemen, let's move on to our final segment, trilateral talks and the road to peace. Professor Tzogopoulos, there are reports of a potential U.S.-Russia-Ukraine trilateral summit in Budapest. If it occurs, what core obstacles would need to be overcome?
The city itself is important. The choice of the city has to be accepted by Russia and Ukraine. This is the most important thing. The choice of the city itself is not the most important thing. The most important thing is the determination of the two sides to talk to each other and start the work in order for this terrible war to end. So far, we have seen that Turkey is one of the countries which has hosted important meetings of Russian and Ukrainian delegations, which were quite fruitful as far as the exchange of prisoners is concerned. And once again, I think that a lot depends on the capacity of President Trump to deliver. So if President Trump continues on the same path, he really wants to make a difference as far as peace in Ukraine is concerned. I'm confident that this meeting will take place. But we are not there yet. More diplomatic work needs to be completed first.
Yaqi, what's your take on the possibility of a Trump-Putin Zelensky meeting?
Yeah, I think what the professor just had mentioned is very important. So the result and the motivation do seem to be not enough to launch this new venue. But also, I would like to say the Budapest venue itself also has some weight. So for Ukraine, Budapest is a toxic symbolism, and being the namesake of the 1994 memo, where the security assurances finally proved worthless. So I guess holding talks in a country also like by the pro-Russian Orban government would be seen as a major concession to Moscow before they even begin. So more fundamentally, the core positions, as we just talked, are really irreconcilable. Ukraine's demand for restoration of its 1991 border as a constitutional and legal imperative, and Russia's demand for recognition of its conquest is non-negotiable. So I would say to fully realize this vision of a U.S.-Russia-Ukraine trilateral summit, the venue itself may need to reconsider, and especially regarding the timing, maybe need to be more carefully reconsidered too.
Professor Mahoney, if I remember correctly, at the beginning you mentioned that you are not very optimistic about a trilateral meeting. How do you see things developing moving forward?
Well, I wasn't very optimistic about seeing Putin go to Alaska, but that happened. So one has to understand that things can move in directions that you don't anticipate. I think the meeting in Budapest is a little fantastical if we remember that the Orban government has territorial claims that it makes against Ukraine. Part of it claims that Greater Hungary that Ukraine owes it territory. So that's interesting by itself. I think there are two concerns here. The first is from the position that we've heard that Zelensky articulated at the White House is a non-starter for continued discussions. So unless they work out something and can present that as a credible breakthrough, I don't see Putin going to a meeting with a man he doesn't recognize as a peer, above all because one of the conditions that Russia has put in place has, and this is the denazification and demilitarization language that we've seen in one of their demands, that this has been broadly interpreted as suggesting that the current government of Ukraine is illegitimate. If he were to attend a meeting and that government was representing positions that were completely unacceptable to the Russian side, then I don't see that Putin would agree to attend a meeting that would essentially legitimize that government, despite it moving in the direction that Russia wouldn't support. So I think we'd have to see some significant concession on the side of Ukraine to entice Putin into a meeting. And there's only one exception to this, and it would have to do with whether or not the venue was a sweet enough attraction for Putin and whether or not Trump would also attend, because clearly Putin relishes the opportunity to flaunt his exchanges with Trump because he knows how much it means to the overall strategic objectives of Russia and certainly the extent to which it frustrates his counterparts in Europe.
Mm-hmm. With that, we conclude today's discussion. Thanks to our insightful panelists. This is Road Today with me, Anna. Until next time.